Hello, everybody out there in Radio Land. It is that time of the week. What time of the week is it? Well, it's that time of the week where we come onto your radio dial and we tell you what's really going on. We dig underneath the headlines, analyze the issues from a working class perspective right here in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and generally call out the establishment on its BS. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo. As always, the following thoughts, views, and opinions are not necessarily those of 89.1 FM WIDR Kalamazoo or Western Michigan University, no matter how dope or insightful they may turn out to be. So we got, as always, we got a lot to talk about on today's show. Later on in the hour, maybe going into the next one, we're going to be doing a protracted bit talking about some pertinent updates involving COVID-19. In particular, kind of what the mainstream media is not talking about. We've got a really good article from World Socialist website. It really dives into how the media has really started to downplay the pandemic, even at a time when we're still seeing some unprecedented death and illness rates from Omicron. And tying into that, we've got some local coverage, local stories about how this kind of collective giving up on recognizing the pandemic affects our schools and our school children. And we'll also be doing kind of a second part of our coronavirus criminals piece. Last week we read a bit from the coronavirus criminals book talking about Pfizer. This week there is one other Michigan criminal that we are going to be talking about. Before we get into all that, though, you know what? Let's start with some good news. It seems like we're always so down and dour on our program, and as much as I hope y'all enjoy some of my funny, hilarious Marxist cynicism, but sometimes it's good to just have some good news. So with that in mind, I wanted to read this story from this is coverage from WWMT, that's our local CBS affiliate here in Kalamazoo. It's written by Andrew Feather, published on Monday, February 7th. Kalamazoo leaders approve $100,000 grant for tiny homes in the Northside neighborhood. Kalamazoo City Commission voted unanimously last Monday night to approve funding for a tiny house development project in Kalamazoo's Northside neighborhood. A $100,000 grant earmarked through the city's Foundation for Excellence will allow for the construction of 3 tiny homes and a leasing office on North Street. The goal is to provide housing for people with criminal backgrounds or substance abuse challenges who often have low incomes and difficulty finding places to live. The homes will be occupied by people or families whose incomes are at or below 60% of area median income. What we're looking at doing is making sure that people who are already at the low end of the totem pole are having equitable access to affordable housing specific to them, said Gwendolyn Hooker, founder of Helping Other People Succeed. I think that's supposed to be succeed? No, it has a Hope Network. Okay. Helping Other People Exceed Through Navigation, which organized the project. On site, there will also be a facility to help residents with basic services to improve their lives. Making sure that they can maintain their homes, making sure that they have everything that they need inside their home, making sure that they have budgeting, financing, all of those things that go along with being a renter, Hooker said. After the COVID-19 pandemic delayed the project for more than a year and a half, designs on the home are expected to be completed by the end of March, with construction underway by mid-August. The homes are expected to be completed by the end of the year. Families have been suffering, individuals have been suffering for years, and so when we talk about barrier removal, that's exactly what this is going to do for so many valuable and worthy people who need housing and have a right to it. Stephanie Hoffman said before voting to approve the grant. Commissioner Esteban Juarez suggested that in the future the commission should consider another grant to complete the planned 6-home project. In an earlier meeting, commissioners discussed the challenges facing the city as it strives to make housing more affordable to city residents. Among the biggest issues is a growing disparity between the average housing costs and the average wage residents make. An analysis from Upjohn Institute presented at the meeting also found a sharp decline in the number of new construction permits issued over the last decade, with the number dropping even further during the pandemic. So just a couple things, if you're a longtime listener, we actually interviewed Gwendolyn about this a couple of years ago. We were all very excited. We always talk a lot about, the necessity of these projects, and, Gwendolyn and the Hope Network deserve a lot of credit and kudos for figuring out the logistics. And, we always want to do a particular tip of the hat to people who, talk about what is to be done and then they actually do it. So, again, big kudos to the Hope Network and Gwen for getting this off the ground. I think it would be necessary for me to have the requisite commentary to say that 6 homes is a start, but it is definitely nowhere near what is needed to address affordable housing issues in the city of Kalamazoo. And that's definitely no shade on Gwendolyn so much as it is shade on the city. It's funny, even the context of this article, they bring up, they mention the Foundation for Excellence. And as we like to point out on the show, and I'm not going to go into the whole dissection of the foundation. The Cliff Notes version is the rich people in this town could have paid taxes. They came up with a tax scam instead. Yes, I am calling the foundation a tax scam. So you have to recognize that there is money in the banana stand, as it were. But the level of investment that we need to really tackle affordable housing is, city is dropping the ball on it. And, frankly, they should be giving, Gwendolyn the resources to, make 600 homes instead of just 6. And hopefully we will see that expand. But, again, if you want to make the city do the right thing, it's kind of like a piñata. You got to public pressure. You got to get the candy out of the piñata. Except, instead of candy, it's, social justice. And I don't mean that literally. Please do not chase after local politicians with sticks. I meant in the sense that if you put a necessary amount of public pressure on the city and the billionaires that run the city, more pointedly, you can extract concessions from them. And this is something that we need to all be very much on top of, trying to pressure the powers that be to expand affordable housing. Because we are always, we are ground zero for gentrification, and we're probably going to be experiencing something of a population boom as we go into the next couple of decades. I meant specifically in the city of Kalamazoo. Not talking about that overpopulation myth stuff. But yeah, again, what we do now sets a precedent for tomorrow, and let's hope, no pun intended, that the resources are forthcoming to continue and invest in more projects like the Hope Networks. So we're going to take a quick little break. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at WIDRFM.org. Just a quick reminder, if you want to listen to the show, there's a couple ways to do that. We upload all episodes. All episodes go up onto our YouTube page. And that's exactly what you hear on the radio, plus or minus some musical interludes. Everything you hear on the radio goes on our YouTube channel. And we also have a podcast where we piece together the best of our on-air material for easy, convenient. You can go online, find our podcast in whatever podcast app you use, and you can download it to your cellular phone. Listen to us on the bus. Listen to us at work. Maybe while you're at work, it'll inspire you to organize your workforce. We'll see. And again, just check out our Facebook page. That's Media Cyphers on Facebook. Y'all listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR, your only source for political revolution.
89.1 Wider FM is the student-run radio station at Western Michigan University. Along with the Western Herald and Western Herald Video, Wider is part of the WMU Student Media Group and is supported in part through generous donations from listeners like you. If you would like to join this list of generous donors, please click the donate button at widrfm.org and support our mission for radio evolution. The website once again, widrfm.org, on your radio at 89.1 Wider FM.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is Media Cyphers, only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. So if you're just joining us, we've got some more stories to talk about. And this next one, I think it's important to highlight good journalism, even if it comes from a more mainstream source. So, WWMT is, I guess I don't want to say necessarily that we've singled them out for coverage, but it is, I think it's an important part. A lot of our show deals with mainstream media criticism and talking about, what is the mainstream media talking about? How are facts skewed? How are, the difference between fake news and paid news, which is to say, not everything on the mainstream media is necessarily false, but everything it's all a profit motive. It's good thing we're saying, there's this idea of the free press in the United States, but at the end of the day, when a handful, you can count them on one hand of, plutocrats and mega corporations own all of the media, then you might as well just have state-censored media. It's just, privatized a bit. So, I wind around to say all of that to point out that WWMT did a really good piece recently about environmental racism, and I wanted to highlight it on the show. I'm going to read from it. Again, I want to make sure credit is being given where credit is due. WWMT, we've criticized them before. Again, their Sinclair station, they do some of those conservative Trumpian must-runs. But at the same time, they do some very good local coverage that is very much needed. The kind of They still are doing a lot of the things and covering a lot of the stories that local news should cover to help be that kind of fourth estate in the communities where they live. So I'm going to read from this article. It's from Michael Krafkic. Michigan's poor and minority communities most impacted by environmental racism. This article/news segment popped up on Monday, February 14th. And this is really a statewide story, too, because it references everything from Benton Harbor to our own issues here in Kalamazoo with graphic packaging. So, again, really good stuff. Anyway, communities across the state, from Flint to Detroit and Benton Harbor, are calling out the impacts from generations of environmental racism and environmental injustice. Data shows people living in the most socially vulnerable populations in Michigan are more likely to be exposed to water, air pollution, and contaminated sites. Activists across the state are calling on state leaders to do more to prevent the next crisis and protect predominantly black communities from environmental injustices. In Benton Harbor, Reverend Edward Pinkney said that he's frustrated over the city's response to Benton Harbor's ongoing water crisis. Pinckney, the executive director of the nonprofit Benton Harbor Water Council, started handing out bottled water to residents in 2018 when high lead levels were detected in the city's drinking water. Pinckney said the state failed to take meaningful action to help residents until he filed an emergency petition with the U.S. EPA in September of 2021. Benton Harbor's population is 85% black and the poorest city in Michigan based on per capita income. They don't care how bad the water is. If we had not filed a petition with the EPA, none of this stuff would be known, Pinckney said. State health officials didn't start providing bottled water to residents until September of 2021, after issuing an advisory for residents to drink and use bottled water. The MDHHS announced February 8th, and it will provide bottled water to Benton Harbor residents until the city's 4,400 lead lines are replaced, a goal Governor Whitmer set for April 2023. A combination of federal, state, and local grants are funding the $33 million Benton Harbor lead line replacement project. This community being deprived mainly because it is a black city. Racism is alive and well. Environmental racism, you're looking at it, Pinckney said. The topic of environmental justice has risen to the forefront in Michigan in the aftermath of the Flint water crisis, which largely poor and a majority black community were exposed to elevated levels of lead in its drinking water beginning in 2014. The modern environmental justice movement is traced to 1982 protests over a proposed toxic waste site being built in a predominantly black North Carolina neighborhood. The conventional wisdom was people of color are not concerned about the environment as whites. I think there's a lot of momentum on environmental justice right now in Michigan and nationally, said Paul Mohai, the founder of the Environmental Justice Program at the University of Michigan. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies, according to the EPA definition. President Joe Biden created an environmental justice agenda in his first year in office, which called for underserved communities to see increase in overall benefits of climate, clean water, and other investments. Governor Gretchen Whitmer formed an environmental justice response team and an advisory council for environmental justice in 2020 to address challenges related to pollution and energy access. A number of Michigan environmental justice activists say the state is still not doing enough to protect vulnerable, low-income, and predominantly black communities. A number of environmental groups sued Michigan Department of Environmental, Great Lakes, and Energy Friday after approving a hot mix asphalt plant near public housing in a low-income neighborhood in Flint. EGLE has previously said its permit approval action highlighted the limitations of federal and state environmental regulations in addressing the concerns raised by residents. The state's environmental regulatory agency called on the EPA to implement its environmental justice principles sooner in November 2021. EPA data shows people of color are more likely to live near industrial areas and breathe polluted air. I'm going to skip down a little bit here. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is going on here in Kalamazoo. Several neighborhoods in Kalamazoo are considered environmental justice hotspots, according to Paul Mohai's environmental justice screening tool. The 49007 zip code, which includes Kalamazoo's Northside neighborhood, is in the top 10 of census tracts with the highest EJ scores in Michigan. And that, again, is environmental justice. And we're going to talk a little bit about why. Longtime Kalamazoo Northside resident Tim Johnson is asthmatic and has COPD, a chronic inflammatory lung disease. We are damaged forever. We grew up in this area our whole life and didn't think living around here this would be a problem we would live and deal with every day, Johnson said. Johnson lives blocks from the Graphic Packaging International plant and the City of Kalamazoo wastewater plant. EGLE approved air permits for the cardboard recycling facility's $600 million expansion last year, despite a history of odor violations in a mostly black neighborhood. A 2020 presentation of data compiled by Dr. David Ansell of Rush Medical Center showed residents in Kalamazoo's predominantly black Northside neighborhood have higher rates of hospitalizations for asthma than any other neighborhood in the city. Federal and state health officials have been studying possible long-term impacts from industrial gases detected in the area. A long-term health assessment report studying long-term impacts from odors detected in the neighborhood is expected to be released late March. Johnson is one of 150 area households interested in joining a class action lawsuit against Graphic Packaging, which accused the cardboard recycling plant of releasing noxious odors, air particulates, and dust into nearby residents' property. A Graphic Packaging spokesperson has previously said its operations don't create a nuisance for nearby residents. Since November, the EPA Civil Rights Office has been investigating if the state of Michigan discriminated against a predominantly black community next to the Graphic Packaging International plant in Kalamazoo when EGLE approved changes to an air permit to allow an additional paperboard line at the facility in November 2020. It's hard to tell if it's getting better or worse because we have to breathe it every day anyway, Johnson said. So anyway, there's more to that article. Again, tip of the hat to WWMT for covering some really important local issues, related to quality of life and social justice. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead. We're going to take another break. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org, your only source for political revolution.
The Iron Temple, every Monday night at 10 o'clock p.m. All the metal your heart desires awaits, only on 89.1 FM, WIDR, Kalamazoo.
Welcome back. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR. So we got a quick hit for y'all, and then we're going to be spending a good chunk of time talking about giving y'all some COVID-19 updates. But something that just dropped yesterday I want to mention on the show. A local nonprofit are raising funds to bring a Black History Museum to downtown Kalamazoo. This is also from WWMT. It's written by Trisha McCauley on February 14th. The Kalamazoo Black History Museum's goal is to establish the museum downtown, although an exact location has not been specified. A lot of folks, even African Americans, don't know our history or our heritage from slavery to modern times, said Reverend William Stein, organizer of the project. Stein said the goal is to educate people of all backgrounds about African American culture and heritage. He said the nonprofit wants the museum to showcase not only Black history, but key figures from Kalamazoo, such as the city's first Black mayor, Gilbert Bradley Jr., and celebrities like Terry Crews, who played football at Western Michigan University, and Derek Jeter, who graduated from Kalamazoo Central High School. I think it's important to know our history and to know how Kalamazoo was formed and to know all the rich culture, State Representative Julie Rogers said. Significant contributions have been made by our African American community. Sorry. That's very politician speak, but I don't know, I digress. Besides exhibits, organizers said they hope the museum will have a movie theater to show historic films, soul food cafe, a chapel for religious services, children's interactive play area, and a gift shop to bring in revenue. Stein said the museum will be a tourism attraction and an economic boom for the city. We are selecting downtown Kalamazoo from a strategic standpoint because we want to help existing businesses in the downtown business corridor to generate revenue, create job opportunities, and encourage people to visit other facilities. Project leaders said the estimated cost for the museum is $30 million. They are currently raising funds and looking for donations. The proposed opening date of the Kalamazoo Black History Museum is Juneteenth of 2024. So yeah, good things. Although I'm a little wary about how much emphasis they put on, improving economic inflow and business and stuff. It's like, I just want a dank museum. It's just like, that's my number one concern. Is it going to be able to really teach people about, local Black history? Is it, how much effort is being put into that? Those are my questions. What kind of exhibits and stuff? I'm not just going to bring in a few more people to, support your local businesses, of course. But, again, it's weird to read this article and just such an emphasis on generating economic activity. Oh, how about we generate, a thought and contemplation within our museum? That's kind of where that's the emphasis I would put on if I were ever written the article, I suppose. So that's a very interesting, exciting news. Looks like come 2024, Kalamazoo may have a Black History Museum in town, which is great. And like I said, I hope it covers a lot about local history. So we talk time and time again on the show. Think locally, act globally, or act locally, think globally. No, act locally, think globally. So that is to say, I know the kind of the audience for my program. A lot of organizer, activist types, leftists and such. Always pay attention to what is going on in your backyard. I've met a lot of armchair intellectuals in my time who, they can, dissect the Spanish Civil War or something. But, I was like, who's the current city council? Describe who are the big billionaires who run the city, blah, blah, just blank stares. So do your homework about the oligarchy in your backyard and get involved with the local org if you got the time. So with that, I think let's transition. We've got a couple of stories involving COVID-19 to talk about. And, usually we go local to national to international. I think I'm going to flip it around here because this article from World Socialist website, I think, kind of sets the table for the other articles that I wanted to mention and talk about. So the World Socialist website has really been on top of following the COVID-19 pandemic from an anti-capitalist, Marxist lens. And they have really, really been hitting hard on the fact of kind of the United States of amnesia. The idea that a lot of the media and the state are, very much, downplaying the current severity of the pandemic. There's this just ongoing march to getting back to normal, and it bleeds out into how the public engages with COVID. Again, I'm around campus. I see a lot of folks who are choosing not to wear masks and stuff. Even when we had a hyper-contagious variant that was, poking through people's vaccine resistance. Granted, less severe than if you had caught COVID a year ago, but at the same time, a certain recklessness. There are people with compromised immune systems. There are older folks out there who maybe even with a vaccine still wouldn't be able to deal with COVID. There's also people for whatever reason can't get vaccinated, and I'm not including the people who choose not to because they read something on Reddit. But again, we all have to be conscientious of one another, and the failure to do that has really been why America is such an embarrassment, why we're almost at 1 million deaths, when every other country in the world has handled, just about every other country in the world has handled this better. I should disinclude countries like Brazil, but that's really just, more or less Bolsonaro being Bolsonaro. But again, like I said, World Socialist website has really been on top of the sort of criticism of how the government has handled the pandemic. And I think this sets up some later stories. We're going to talk about COVID and schools and education that our next two pieces will be about. Don't worry, I choked on my own spit. That wasn't a COVID cough, just to make anybody weary. Anyway, This is an article. It's published on the World Socialist website on February 13th, written by Benjamin Mateus. As U.S. COVID-19 deaths continue to surge, corporate media maintains a near blackout. COVID-19 deaths in the United States have reached their highest level during the Omicron wave, coinciding not with escalating efforts to save lives, but an escalating drive to cover up the devastating impact of the pandemic on the health of the American people. Mandatory reporting of COVID-19 deaths by hospital systems to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services ended on February 2nd. Additionally, in quick succession, states across the country are allowing their mask mandates to lapse. New York Governor Kathy Hochul dropped the state's stringent indoor mask mandate last Wednesday. These include populist Democratic-held states such as Illinois, California, and New Jersey, to name a few. According to the Worldometer dashboard, the 7-day moving average reached 2,600 deaths per day by the end of January. On February 1st, the New York Times COVID-19 dashboard recorded a daily average of 2,653 deaths with a single-day high of 3,582. Since then, the COVID-19 trackers report a sudden and significant drop in the daily death averages, 2,044 for Worldometer and 2,454 for the New York Times. Only the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center, one of the leading and most reliable trackers frequently used by government and international bodies, has indicated that the number of deaths has plateaued or continues to climb, though at a much slower pace. According to their tracker, the 7-day average for COVID-19 deaths remains over 2,500. Indeed, the change in the trajectory of deaths can be supported by the decline in new infections and hospitalizations of COVID-19, although they still remain at pandemic highs. However, other countries with similar trajectories in their infection metrics have continued to see deaths climb, with Denmark and South Africa being two notable examples. Aside from how hospital administrators and health officials are adjusting their reports of COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths, recent efforts on the part of states and governments to dismantle reporting systems are part of the more considerable effort to dispense with such metrics altogether, as they interfere with efforts to force schools and businesses to open and stay open while getting the country back to work en masse permanently. The critical and necessary tracking of infections has grown to become a nuisance for the ruling elite. In this regard, the complete silence on the part of major media outlets on the number of deaths that continue to mount plays a major role. A cursory survey of the U.S. Sunday papers is remarkable in that no one has mentioned the devastating toll the Omicron variant continues to take on the population. The rapid shift is astounding. One would assume that the pandemic has ended, or that it was a nightmare from which we are all awakening. In reality, the nightmare continues in a new form. Placing the present daily COVID-19 death toll into context, more than 2,700 people died on September 11, 2001, in the World Trade Center towers and the surrounding area after 2 hijacked planes were flown into the buildings. The deaths were eulogized and referenced repeatedly on every major news outlet. They were used as a pretext for U.S. wars across the Middle East and suppression of democratic rights at home, which have had considerable relevance to developments during the pandemic. And last week, more than 1,400 people died from COVID-19, the equivalent of almost 5 9/11 events. But there is barely a mention by any media commentator. That is because these deaths are attributable not to a terrorist enemy, but the U.S. ruling class itself, and both its parties, Democrats and Republican, whose deliberate policy has allowed the disease to run rampant throughout the country. Since New Year's Day 2022, more than 90,000 people in the U.S. have perished from COVID-19 and its complications. This is equivalent to twice the number of American combatants killed in combat in the Vietnam conflict. Instead of a war that encompassed a dozen years, the pandemic deaths took place in the span of just 6 weeks. Furthermore, since President Joe Biden has sworn into office, more than 500,000 Americans have died of COVID-19, bringing the total number of coronavirus deaths to more than 943,000, according to the Worldometer. Indeed, far more people have died under Biden's administration than under Trump, as the twin parties of American capitalism pursued the policy of herd immunity. It is noteworthy that the plans to end the last vestiges of the paltry mitigation measures were drawn up even before anyone heard of the Omicron variant. Inevitably, these had to be put on hold for several months after Omicron sparked a huge surge in the pandemic. Last week, the New York Times wrote, "The easing of New York's pandemic restrictions on businesses comes as Democrat-led states from New Jersey to California have announced similar moves this week, in a loosely coordinated effort that is a result of months of public health planning, back-channel discussions, and political focus groups that began in the weeks after the November elections." That the Omicron surge delayed only briefly this closing down of public health measures only underscores the wholly unscientific character of the decision. The federal and state governments were driven not by data and analysis, but by the necessity to recoup the trillions paid out to corporate America in the course of the pandemic. With the number of cases on the decline, but still at staggering levels, governors took their concerns to the White House, demanding the shift to living with the virus under the guise that SARS-CoV-2 was on its way to becoming endemic. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, also the vice chairman of the National Governors Association, speaking to reporters after meeting with Biden, said, "What does the road from pandemic to endemic look like, and how do we keep score?" There was broad agreement that that's the task before us. In other words, the ending of the pandemic also means the termination of all the metrics and measures that remind the population that a deadly virus continues to kill people at record highs, with a cumulative death toll approaching closer to 1 million every day. Indeed, what does the road from pandemic to endemic look like? The Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, a UK government body that advises the central government, recently published on February 10th a paper by academics on COVID-19 viral evolution scenarios. They provide 4 scenarios from the most optimistic to the direst. They wrote, "In each scenario, it is assumed that a relatively stable, repeating pattern is reached over time, 2 to 10 years. But it is likely that the transition to this will be highly dynamic and unpredictable. It may not be possible to know with confidence from what happens in the next 12 to 18 months which long-term pattern will emerge." They note particularly, there's also a feedback loop between the global epidemic dynamics and viral evolution and adaptation. Higher global COVID-19 prevalence provides more opportunities for viral evolution, while new variants can drive higher prevalence. And they warn that it should not be assumed that a more transmissible variant is necessarily of lower severity or vice versa. On the contrary, in the worst-case scenario, a more lethal and more contagious variant may emerge. Dr. Zoe Hyde, an epidemiologist and biostatistician at the University of Western Australia and an expert on COVID-19, in response to the report, wrote on social media, "The base-case scenario doesn't seem realistic. It's inconsistent with what's occurred so far. Based on our experience with COVID to date, the central pessimistic scenario seems most likely to me. However, I think one element of the worst-case scenario, increasing long-term impacts following infection, may also be correct." As with the 20th and 21st century wars, modern pandemics are foreseeable, preventable, and stoppable. Both erupt as a byproduct of deeply ingrained contradictions of the capitalist mode of production. In both instances, the scale of death leads to a massive social crisis that brings to the forefront the necessity of the socialist revolution by the working class to offer a road forward. You can tell in articles from the World Socialist website, because it'll always end with a call to the, revolution for the working class. Good. Well, I wish more articles ended that way. Anyway, we're going to take a quick little break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how the context of that article we just read is playing out here in the state of Michigan in our schools, and the way that when Omicron was surging the most, many school districts were waiving or stopping their mask mandates. Y'all listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org, your only source for political revolution.
Want to get weekly updates from the Wider directors? Head on over to our website at widerfm.org.
Click on Weekly Newsletter tab.
Yes. The newsletter come up. I want to really read about all DJs, what they listen to, all these announcements.
You can also find an invite link to our Discord where we post updated information about upcoming shows, events, and all things Wider.
It's very exciting. This has been a message from 89.1 Wider FM online at widrfm.org.
Hello again, everybody out there in Radio Land. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers, only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. So next up, we've got this article from MLive which talks about how Michigan schools responded to the Omicron surge, i.e. they did not respond well. And again, it kind of ties back to the article we were just talking about from World Socialist website, talking about the role of not only the corporate media, but the state in trying to downplay the severity of the pandemic. So this article is titled, "As COVID Surged, Michigan Schools Scrapped Mask Mandates." It's written by Justin P. Hicks, and it was published on February 7th. Michigan has seen a 32% decrease in K-12 schools requiring masking from the first month of the 2021 to 22 academic year until early February, despite the state's COVID-19 infections being more than quadruple what they were in the fall. As of Thursday, February 3rd, there were 174 traditional public school districts operating with mask mandates. That's compared to 257 such districts in mid-September, meaning 112,785 fewer students are required to wear a mask as a means to curb viral transmission. Officials from schools that have elected to move away from mask mandates have said students aren't contracting the virus inside of school, but rather getting sick from non-school activities where masks aren't required. Requiring kids to wear masks all day long when the likelihood is that they're going to get COVID away from school doesn't make sense, said Garth Cooper, superintendent of Allendale Public Schools, which elected to ditch its mandate after the Ottawa County policy expired. So just a quick aside. My listeners at home can probably already start thinking about how stupid this argument is. But so you're just going to hand wave and say, like, oh, the students are getting it. They're getting it outside of school. Based on what? What data do you have to prove that? Also, here's what common sense says. If you understand, grade school germ theory, schools are a very dense, packed environment where you are in enclosed spaces with other people all day, i.e., the perfect vector, the perfect place for you to catch a contagious disease. And to deny that basic common sense means either you're really dumb or you are willfully spreading some misinformation in order to keep the schools open or not have to wear a mask. Anyway, I'm going to keep going. Some superintendents pointed to vaccines being available for all school-aged children as a reason to move away from forced masking. While vaccines are available to all children 5 years and older, uptake of the shots has remained low. As of Tuesday, February 1st, about 25.6% of children 5 to 11 gotten their first shot, and 20.4% were fully vaccinated. So, an important side note about masking is, again, these people seem to completely misunderstand how the vaccine works, or they know how it works and they're just extremely selfish people. Let me explain what I mean. So I'm vaxxed and boosted, and I still wear a mask when I go everywhere. And the reason I do that is not to protect myself from COVID, but so if I catch it, if I'm non-symptomatic, there's less likelihood I can give it to somebody else. Because as I mentioned near the top of the show, there are a lot of reasons people could still be vulnerable. If they're immunocompromised, if they're older, even if they've been vaccinated, it still could be very complicated and dangerous for them to catch COVID. And then there's people who can't get vaccinated for whatever reason. We are not to say like, well, if so many kids have been vaccinated, why wear masks? And the answer is to protect the vulnerable. It's really like something I just can't stand from these anti-mask people. So traumatize their kids to wear masks. Okay, well, what about like immunocompromised little Billy? Is it going to be pretty traumatizing to their family when Billy is on a ventilator and dies alone in the hospital? Is that going to be traumatic? I think so. Anyway. Going on. Vaccination rates for children 12 to 19 are better, but not great, with about 50% of the population at least partially vaccinated and 45.6% fully vaccinated. Many superintendents said that they were following the lead of their local health departments when it comes to recommending but not requiring their schools to mask up. That's the case in Vicksburg, where Superintendent Kevin O'Neill rescinded the district's mask mandate alongside the health department in December. O'Neill said he cautions people from assuming what mitigation strategies are working in schools based on information from the COVID-19 dashboards. O'Neill said case numbers in schools are not dependent solely on mask usage, but also on students' other activities. In December, the majority of the district's cases were traced to an exposure outside of school. To determine that it's the school or the community is a very, very challenging question, O'Neill said. What's not a challenging question is thinking through whether, a school would be a good breeding ground for a contagious virus. And the answer is yes. I cannot get this common sense done enough. Anyway, 10 of Michigan's 83 counties remain under local health department mask mandates, including Antrim, Benzie, Charlevoix, Emmett, Ingham, Leelanau, Oakland, Otsego, Washtenaw, and Wayne. Meanwhile, mandates have expired or been removed in at least 10 other counties, including Allegan, Barry, Berrien, Eaton, Genesee, Kalamazoo, Kent, Marquette, Ottawa, and St. Clair. And just a quick reminder, y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on WIDR Kalamazoo. Governor Gretchen Whitmer and state health officials chose at the beginning of the school year to leave masking decisions up to local health departments, districts, and school boards. The state hasn't pivoted from that call, though that doesn't mean that they support the decline in schools mandating masking. Certainly, getting rid of any mitigation strategies when we are at what appears to be close to the peak of this surge is not great timing. It's not optimal. Dr. Natasha Bagdasarian, the state's acting chief medical executive, said Wednesday, January 26th. The state's recommendation regarding universal masking in schools still applies. In September, 43% of Michigan's public school districts had mandatory mask policies in place for students in all K-12 grades. Those policies covered 60% of the state's public school students, or about 758,000 children and teens. As of February, 32.6% of those districts have a mask mandate covering 686,114 students, or about 54.8% of that population. The decline in requiring masking comes as Michigan continues to battle its fourth significant surge, charged by the more infectious Omicron variant. Michigan has reported an average of 9,480 new confirmed COVID cases per day over the last week, which is down from 14,335 cases per day a week earlier. However, it's still drastically higher than the less than 2,000 cases reported per day the first week of September. Schools are among the leading settings for known COVID-19 outbreaks as well. As of Monday, January 31st, the state was aware of 410 active outbreaks, up from 309 the week prior. Going on, says, in Allendale, Cooper said his district board of education fought hard to have local control rather than have decisions on masks in schools or other COVID-19 mitigation strategies come from the county health department. The district looked at case counts in Allendale and among the school community in early January when the Ottawa County Health Department's mandate for K-6 would expire. Under the health department mandate, masks were required during the first half of the school year for students in kindergarten through 6th grade. The district chose to keep masks optional for grades 7 through 12, Cooper said. He said his district saw the same number of positive cases among older students as other districts that did require masks. District leaders are compared internally students who were masked and those who are not. In a building where they were required to wear masks, we had more positive cases than in our building where they weren't required, Cooper says. Okay. Yeah. Superintendent says he compares his district's dashboard to others in the area with mask mandates and sees the same number of cases. This is an important time to bring up. Correlation is not necessarily causation. Again, there's a number of variables that could be panning out this information data they're seeing. But I think he's trying to imply that masks are not effective or are somehow worse than being unmasked, which is just very clearly not true. There's some very basic physics around this. If you put something between your mouth and the outside, a barrier, it's more effective than not having anything there at all. Anyway, And again, repeating that whole thing about students are contracting COVID outside of school, which again, that's not how physics or germ theory works. But anyway, actually, I think I'm going to leave it there. But the basic gist of the article is that a lot of school districts here in Michigan, even when Omicron was surging, decided to do away with their mask mandates. And apparently, according to that last one, you see how they're using kind of the similar talking points and some very fuzzy math to defend no longer requiring masks in schools. Even though, again, this is like a common sense thing to do when you have any sort of contagious viral pathogen spreading around. And, again, tying it to that article from World Socialist website, it's all tied into the way that our government, the state, is messaging people on how to deal with COVID, and the way the media is trying to downplay the severity of the pandemic that we are in. Because if people take their cues from that, then they feel that, okay, well, we don't necessarily need to take it seriously, or like this, we can let it kind of recede into the background. It's going to become endemic, like the flu or the cold, even though the death rate of this virus is still extremely high. It's irresponsible, and, well, that's capitalism, baby. You notice something about, it's like, you get into a lot of debates, and, if you're here on the college campus, it probably happens a lot. You get in debate with some conservative or right-winger, and, they always be cherry-picking, like, information, data about, like, Venezuela, or, like, the socialist countries did this and they do that. It's like, well, one thing you can't take away from socialist countries is, like, they've handled this pandemic like adults, and they have made sure that all of them have done extremely well in making sure that their citizens are, for the most part, protected from this virus. Even like China, where it started, the case numbers are in like the single digits some days, and they are a much larger country, if you didn't know. Again, we complained a lot last year about the Trump administration just trying to kind of sacrifice workers to the volcano, and the Biden administration really hasn't done anything all that much different. It's just, telling everybody to get shots first. But, other than that, it's like we said a couple weeks ago on our Biden year one evaluation, it's probably the single worst fumble in his first year. He's like, I'm going to handle the pandemic like a grown-up. And I was like, well, he is. He's handling it like a grown-up capitalist. As it turns out, isn't all that much better from a man-baby clown capitalist. Who'd have thunk? Anyway, y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. Just a quick reminder, there's a couple ways to listen to the show. We're live on the air every Tuesday at noon, of course. But you can also listen to us online, and a couple ways to do that. We upload every radio episode to our YouTube page. That's Media Cyphers on YouTube. So, the full audio, exactly as you hear on the radio, you can hear it on the YouTubes. We also have a podcast where we put together the best of our on-air material and sometimes little bonuses here and there. And that's our podcast on Podbean. You should be able to find it on most podcasting apps or podcast apps. Again, that's Media Cyphers Kalamazoo is the name of that. And we just put out a really interesting episode about coronavirus criminals. For that, we had a great interview with Nathan Dannison. And stay tuned. Next week, we're going to have a really great episode, about an hour-long discussion with Jacob Penny Johnson about some local black history. But anyway, we're going to take a quick little break. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about Michigan's own coronavirus criminals. Part 2. All right. Keep your dial locked. It is your only source for political revolution. Hello, everybody out there in Radio Land. We are back. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at WIDRFM.org. So if you're just tuning in, we've been giving you some pertinent COVID-19 updates. Talk about an article from the World Socialist website that really indicts the mainstream media and the Biden administration for downplaying the severity of the pandemic. And we talk about a local story from MLive here in the state, talking about how here in the state of Michigan that is playing out in our public schools. And on the topic of coronavirus and our public schools, I'm going to do, this is kind of the second part. Last week, if you listened to our show, we talked about the complicity of Pfizer and kind of profiteering from the pandemic. And today we're going to talk about the role of Betsy DeVos when they were education secretary and how they were also something of a coronavirus criminals. And this it comes from a new book by John Nichols. It's called Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers, Accountability for Those Who Caused the Crisis. And this is the second part of what I call Michigan's own coronavirus criminals. And as we all know, Betsy DeVos, of course, from Grand Rapids. And many of us Michiganders spent about 4 years apologizing to the rest of the country when they were education secretary. But it goes on to talk about how, Betsy DeVos's long-standing desire to basically strangle/starve out the public school system. The pandemic provided an ample disaster capitalism style opportunity to try to push exactly that. So in this chapter, the chapter is called How Betsy DeVos Tried to Leverage a Pandemic to Privatize Public Education. There could be no debating that Florida had become a pandemic hotspot by early July 2020. The total number of coronavirus cases in the state had surpassed 300,000, while the number of deaths topped 4,500. Things were getting worse at such a rapid rate that the local media could barely keep up with the bad news. Florida set single-day record for coronavirus deaths with 132, adds 9,100 new cases, announced the NBC affiliate in Miami on July 15th. 24 hours later, the Miami Herald was reporting Florida sees another coronavirus fatality record of 156 as nearly 14,000 new cases added. What was especially unsettling to public school teachers was the news of what might come next. Echoing messages from the Trump White House, the Republican governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, began pushing for the reopening of schools across the state with this casual declaration. We spent months saying that there were certain things that were essential. That included fast food restaurants, included Walmart, included Home Depot. If all that is essential, then educating our kids is absolutely essential. This was a typical rhetorical gambit from DeSantis, a career politician who had grabbed the governorship in 2018 with a campaign that dealt in enough racist tropes and crude innuendo to secure him a narrow win. Like Trump, DeSantis never allowed the facts or concern for public health and safety to get in the way of exploiting an opening to advance himself politically. And the governor knew that parents were anxious about the coming school year. If he could make himself look like an advocate for getting kids back into the state's classrooms, it might ease concerns about the way in which his budgets and policies undermine public education. DeSantis had no plan for getting the return of the classroom right, however. He merely brandished an executive order from Florida Education Commissioner Richard Corcoran, which required schools to reopen and to provide the full array of services that are required by law so that families who wish to educate their children in a brick-and-mortar school full-time have the opportunity to do so. On July 14th, 4 weeks before the first day of school, Florida Education Association President Frederick Ingram reported that teachers were terrified. You know what they're doing right now, he asked, with their lesson plans? They're preparing living wills. They're preparing wills to make sure that if anything happens to them, their families are taken care of. That's what's happening right now in the state of Florida with teachers and educational support professionals and cafeteria workers and bus drivers who don't do this for money. Ingram was not engaging in hyperbole. A law firm in the Tampa Bay region was actually offering free living wills for teachers involuntarily forced to return to the classroom. Inspired by news reports of 3 Arizona elementary school teachers who returned to work in June and contracted COVID-19, resulting in the death of 61-year-old educator Kimberly Chavez Lopez Bird, Gallagher and Associates law firm announced, "While we agree with medical experts that it is premature to reopen schools in this Tampa Bay hot zone, we want to do our part to help teachers that are forced to return." Attorney Charles Gallagher explained, "It's not physically possible, with the room they have logistically, to distance, and it's not physically possible for them to be apart from other teachers and other kids." Things were bad in Florida, but this wasn't just a Florida problem. Healthcare experts were raising alarms nationally. While children are at less risk for serious illness from coronavirus than adults and often have mild or no symptoms when infected, the teachers and other adult staff in schools face higher risk, reported the Kaiser Family Foundation. We use a similar approach to look at teachers and other instructors, and we find that 1 in 4 teachers, that's 24%, or about 1.47 million people, have a condition that puts them at high risk of serious illness from coronavirus. Decisions about opening schools are generally made at the state and local level. But in the brave new world of the coronavirus pandemic, the danger of an uneven and ill-thought-out reopening of schools pointed to the need for clear standards and guidance. If ever there was a time when the country needed an experienced and engaged Secretary of Education to bring not just clarity, but an appropriate sense of concern to a dangerous moment, this was it. In other words, there could not have been a worse time in history for Betsy DeVos to be heading the U.S. Department of Education. A billionaire campaign donor who had spent decades seeking to subvert public education, DeVos was openly hostile to public school teachers and the unions that represented them, leading the National Education Association to note that as Donald Trump's appointee to the nation's top education post, she had promoted the privatization of public schools through vouchers, called for deep cuts to federal funding, rolled back protections for vulnerable children, and shilled for the for-profit college industry that had defrauded countless students. Not even a pandemic could cause DeVos to show concern for educators whose lives might be endangered. Trump's Secretary of Education wasn't about to say no to Republican governors like DeSantis. To do so would have put her at odds with her political benefactor's cruel scheme to enhance his own re-election prospects by pressuring schools to reopen at a point when the country was experiencing a COVID-19 surge. DeVos remained absolutely loyal to the president because he had empowered her to advance the privatization schemes that were her longtime passion. When he no longer empowered her after his defeat in the 2020 election and the January 6th storming of the Capitol by his supporters, she would quit the administration with a blunt rebuke to Trump on January 8th. But while even the slightest prospect of a second Trump term remained, DeVos was more than ready to amplify the president's threats and build upon them as part of a crudely cynical campaign strategy. Trump had grown increasingly obsessed during the summer of 2020 with reopening schools, just as he'd been obsessed with opening businesses in the spring of the year. The president imagined that doing so would create a sense of normalcy in the midst of the healthcare crisis he had so thoroughly mismanaged and an economic meltdown that extended from it. Trailing in the polls, Trump was determined to rush children back to school and get workers back to their offices, warehouse, and factories in order to foster the fantasy that he had led the country out of the mess he made and now merited a second term. "Schools must open in the fall," screamed Trump's Twitter feed on July 7th. "The Dems think it will be bad for them politically if U.S. schools open for the November election, but it's important for children and families," the president tweeted on July 8th. "May cut off funding if not open." As usual with Trump's digital pronouncements, his reopen the schools ranting was a muddle of misplaced urgency, factual distortions, and nonsense. By the time Trump and DeVos came to the debate about reopening schools, Democrats and rational Republicans had for months been struggling to figure out when and how it might be safe to get students and teachers back in their classrooms. So too had the unions that represent teachers and advocate for public education. The American Federation of Teachers started developing plans in April 2020 with a recognition, as AFT President Randy Weingarten explained, that reopening schools had to be done safely and thoughtfully. The fight against the coronavirus is far from over. The second wave of the 1918 flu was worse than the first, she said. Absent a vaccine, no one knows what the future will bring. Adhering to public health safeguards is critical. For the most part, teachers, parents, and students were not resistant to reopening. What they were saying was that the reopening had to be done right. What Trump and DeVos were saying was that they did not care if it was done wrong, even if that meant teachers, staffers, and students were more likely to be infected, even if they and people they came into contact with might die. When Trump finally turned his attention to education concerns, at a point when schools had been closed for months, the president began by attacking Centers for Disease Control and Prevention guidelines that were essential to a safe and functional reopening of the schools. Then he threatened to withhold resources that are desperately needed to maintain public education, be it in person or virtual. Trump and DeVos turned a debate that should have been grounded in science into a political food fight. Their goal isn't safety, it's politics, an exasperated Weingarten said in mid-July. Weingarten, a former social studies teacher at Clara Barton High School in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, urged students, parents, and teachers to listen carefully to what Trump and his education secretary were saying about reopening. Are they putting the safety of kids or educators first? No, she said. Do they have a plan to actually reopen schools or resources for it? No. President Trump's response was to retweet game show host Chuck Woolery's paranoid rants on how the most outrageous lies are the ones about COVID-19. Everyone is lying. The CDC, media, Democrats, our doctors, not all but most. Now we are told to trust. I think it's all about the election and keeping the economy from coming back, which is about the election. I'm sick of it. I'm pretty sick of retired old game show hosts spreading misinformation on the internet. But anyway, seems to be a lot of that going around lately. Anyway, there's a plenty of political sickness in the Trump administration in the summer of 2020, and Betsy DeVos was spreading it. The broken record critic of public education headed an agency that claimed its mission was to play a leadership role in the ongoing national dialogue over how to improve the results of our education system for all students. Instead of leading an honest dialogue, however, DeVos was amplifying the anti-scientific claptrap that underpinned Trump's strategy for reopening schools. CDC guidelines were clear about safe policies for schools. Lowest risk, faculty and students engaged in virtual-only learning options, activities, and events. Highest risk, full-sized in-person classes, activities, and events. Students are not spaced apart, share classroom materials or supplies, and mix between classes and activities. Yet DeVos disregarded and dismissed these guidelines. There's nothing in the data that would suggest that kids being back in school is dangerous to them, she claimed. Educators and public health experts who said different, she griped, were just fear-mongering and making excuses. When confronted with details of actual outbreaks, DeVos casually suggested that any little flare-ups or hotspots can be dealt with on a school-by-school or case-by-case basis. In a July interview with far-right Fox News host Tucker Carlson, DeVos echoed Trump's threats about withholding funds from schools that might fail to start full-time in-person instruction in September. We are looking at this very seriously, she said. This is a very serious issue across the country. She was even more outspoken in another appearance on Fox when she told Chris Wallace, American investment in education is a promise to students and their families. If schools are going to reopen and not fulfill that promise, they shouldn't get the funds. Then give it to the families to decide to go to a school that is going to meet that promise. This was DeVos returning to one of her favorite themes, taking money intended for public education and redirecting it to fund private schools. It's a move toward privatization, said Jamal Bowman, a public school principal who had recently won a Democratic primary for a U.S. House seat representing the Bronx. It's driven by market-based ideology and the so-called quote-unquote choice movement. So when we talk about vouchers and money moving with kids at the whim of the parents, that's what we're talking about. And it's an example of disaster capitalism within the public education sector. Former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich was blunt. Don't let DeVos use the pandemic to privatize education, he said. Representative Ayanna Pressley was even blunter. You have no plan. The Massachusetts Democrat told DeVos on social media. Pressley spoke to the Secretary of Education language that parents across the country well understood. Teachers, kids, and parents are fearing for their lives. You point to a private sector that has put profits over people and claimed the lives of thousands of essential workers. I wouldn't trust you to care for a houseplant, let alone my child. Again, that is from the book Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers by John Nichols, and that chapter was How Betsy DeVos Tried to Leverage a Pandemic to Privatize Public Education. Anyway, we're going to take a quick little break. Y'all listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. your only source for political revolution.
You are listening to Wider FM online at widrfm.org.
Hello, Wider listeners. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. Got one more story for you. I think we're going to end with this is an international story. And I want to bring some clarity. So, the last couple episodes we talked about when we mentioned the kind of warmongering, war hawking going on with Russia right now. This idea that, Putin's amping up to invade the Ukraine, and the United States, the noble empire that we are, has to stop them. I'm not going to dive into those political dynamics at the moment, but something we've also mentioned is the way that the United States has funded right-wing paramilitary death squads in the Ukraine who are explicitly fascist or Nazi. And I wanted to be more specific and dive a little deeper on that. So I had a couple folks ask me questions about it. So I wanted to bring you this article that kind of goes into the nitty-gritty details. And so that y'all know when I say we're supporting like Nazi paramilitary groups in the Ukraine, this is what I'm talking about. So this is an article by Brinko Marcetic. It's from Jacobin magazine. The CIA may be breeding Nazi terror in Ukraine. And this article is from January 15th. The U.S. government has a well-documented history of backing extremist groups as part of a panoply of foreign policy misadventures, which inevitably end up blowing up in the American public's face. In the 1960s, the CIA worked with Cuban anti-Fidel Castro radicals who turned Miami into a hub of terrorist violence. In the 1980s, the same agency reported and encouraged Islamic radicals converging in Afghanistan, who would go on to orchestrate the September 11th attack. And in the 2010s, Washington backed Syria's not-so-moderate rebels, who ended up cutting a swath of atrocities through civilians and the Kurdish forces that were meant to be U.S. allies. Based on a new report, it looks like we may soon be able to add another to that list of fatally unlearned lessons: Ukrainian neo-Nazis. According to a recent Yahoo News report, since 2015, the CIA has been secretly training forces in Ukraine to serve as insurgent leaders, in the words of one former intelligence official, in case Russia ends up invading the country. Current officials are claiming the training is purely for intelligence collection, but the former officials Yahoo spoke to said the program involved training in firearms, cover and move, and camouflage, among other things. Given the facts, there's a good chance that the CIA is training actual, literal Nazis as part of this effort. The year the program started, 2015, also happened to be the same year that Congress passed a spending bill that featured hundreds of millions of dollars worth of economic and military support for Ukraine, one that was expressly modified to allow that support to flow to the country's resident neo-Nazi militia, the Azov Regiment. According to The Nation at the time, the text of the bill passed in the middle of that year featured an amendment explicitly barring arms training and other assistance to Azov. But the House committee in charge of the bill was pressured by the Pentagon months later to remove the language, falsely telling them it was redundant. Despite sometimes open acknowledgement of its Nazism, its former commander once said the historic mission of Ukraine is to, quote-unquote, lead the white races of the world in a final crusade for their survival, in a crusade against the Semite-led Untermenschen. Azov was incorporated into the country's National Guard in 2014, owing to its effectiveness in fighting Russian separatists. U.S. arms have flowed to the militia. NATO and U.S. officials have been pictured meeting with them, and members of the militia have talked about their work with U.S. trainers and the lack of background screening to weed out white supremacists. Given all this, it would be more of a surprise that the neo-Nazis of Azov haven't been trained in the CIA's clandestine Make an Insurgency program. And we're already seeing the early signs of blowback. A number of prominent individuals among far-right extremist groups in the United States and Europe have actually sought out relationships with representatives of the far-right in Ukraine, specifically the National Corps and its associated militia, the Azov Regiment. States a 2020 report from the West Point U.S. Military Academy's Combating Terrorism Center. U.S.-based individuals have spoken or written about how the training available in Ukraine might assist them and others in their paramilitary-style activities at home. A 2018 FBI affidavit asserted that Azov is believed to have participated in training and radicalizing United States-based white supremacy organizations, including members of the white supremacist Rise Above movement, prosecuted for planned assaults on counter-protesters at far-right events, including the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally that Joe Biden later co-opted as a rationale for his presidential campaign. While it seems the perpetrator of the Christchurch Mosque massacre didn't travel to Ukraine as he claimed, he clearly took inspiration from the far-right movement there and wore a symbol used by Azov members while carrying out the attack. Since taking office, Biden has launched an incipient domestic war on terror on the basis of combating far-right extremism, even though the strategy is quietly aiming to target left-wing protesters and activists, something it has already done. Yet at the same time, 3 separate administrations, Biden's included, have been providing training, weapons, and equipment to the very far-right movement that's inspiring and even training those same white supremacists. Adding to the absurdity here is that the reason Washington has been giving Ukrainian Nazis its assistance is so that they can serve as a bulwark against Russia, which war hawks liken, as they always do, to Adolf Hitler's regime and its expansion through Europe in the 1930s. While Vladimir Putin's Russia may be a malevolent actor on a number of fronts, Putin's recent incursions into neighboring states like Ukraine are driven largely by the expansion of the NATO military alliance up to his borders and the security implications that come with it. In other words, to stop what U.S. hawks classify as the next Hitler and Nazi Germany, Washington has been backing literal neo-Nazi militias in Ukraine, who are in turn communicating with and training homegrown white supremacists, which Washington in turn is ramping up a menacing repressive bureaucracy at home to counter. It's what some have called the self-licking ice cream cone in action, the U.S. national security establishment creating the very threats that justify itself. Instead of diffusing the tensions by simply agreeing to long-standing Russian demands to set a hard limit on NATO's eastward expansion, Washington has apparently decided that unlimited planetary military dominion is so important they would rather just get into bed with actual fascists. The U.S. alliance with Nazi-infected Ukraine has already proven awkward for a president who is both trying to strike a contrast with his far-right predecessor and establish the United States as the leader of a global effort to strengthen democracy. Late last year, in a vote that went completely unreported in the press, the United States was just one of 2 countries, the other being Ukraine, to vote against a UN draft resolution combating glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices that contribute to fueling contemporary forms of racism. Both countries have consistently voted against this resolution every single year since 2014. The Biden administration deployed a nearly identical boilerplate explanation for its no vote that Donald Trump had used, citing the constitutional right to free speech, even for those with repugnant views. But this concern is hard to square with the text, which simply expresses concern about public memorials, demonstrations, and rehabilitation of the Nazis, condemns Holocaust denial and hate violence, and calls on governments to eliminate racism through education and addressing far-right terrorist threats. All roughly the same as Biden's own rhetoric and policies. Washington's real concern here lies in its description of the resolution as thinly veiled attempts to legitimize Russian disinformation campaigns denigrating neighboring nations, meaning the Ukraine. But Ukraine's connections to modern Nazism are far from Russian fake news, are in fact extensive and well documented. From Azov's official incorporation into the ranks of Ukrainian law enforcement and government officials with far-right ties to state-sponsored tributes to Nazi collaborators and promotion of Holocaust denial. It's no small irony that the U.S. president, elected in large part to halt the perceived march of fascism at home, is continuing long-standing U.S. support for literal Nazis and might well be the nexus of international fascism. If these Ukrainian Nazis really are among the insurgents being trained by the CIA, it'll be no small tragedy if they one day take the same career trajectory as Osama bin Laden. Again, that was from Jacobin, written by Branko Marcetic. That article was titled, "The CIA May Be Breeding Nazi Terror in Ukraine." Okay, we're going to take a quick little break. We've got about 20 minutes left on the program. I'm going to look up some material to play on the show. My voice is kind of shot out for now, but something to do with Black History Month. We'll see. Anyway, keep that locked. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. Again, if you want to check out the show, there's a couple ways to do that. We upload our full radio episodes onto YouTube. That's our YouTube page. Look us up, Media Cyphers on YouTube. We also have a podcast you can find on most podcasting apps. Media Cyphers Kalamazoo, where we take the best pieces and portions of our radio program and put them for easy access up online. You can download it onto your phone, and you can listen to it on the bus, at work, maybe radicalize your fellow workers, keep that locked. We got more Media Cyphers coming up. This is Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR, your only source for political revolution.
89.1 Wider FM is a student-run radio station at Western Michigan University, along with the Western Herald and Western Herald Video. Wider is a part of the WMU Student Media Group and is supported in part through generous donations from listeners like you. If you would like to join this list of generous donors, please click the donate button at widrfm.org and support our mission for radio evolution. The website, once again, widrfm.org. On your radio at 89.1 Wider FM.